Deep beneath the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, there are chambers that Turkish authorities have kept sealed for over a century. The walls are covered with explicit scenes so disturbing that when archaeologists first discovered them in 1924, half the team refused to continue working. These aren't just erotic art, they're detailed instructional guides for sexual practices that shaped the Ottoman Empire for over 600 years. Practices so horrific that the Turkish government has spent millions ensuring you never learn about them. But 3 years ago, a Turkish archivist risked his life to leak authentic Ottoman palace records that reveal the truth. And what you're about to discover isn't the sanitized version of Ottoman civilization they taught you in school. Welcome to the Hollow Throne. I'm about to show you sexual practices so systematic, so deliberately cruel, that they make modern human trafficking operations look amateur by comparison. This is the real Ottoman Empire, not the romantic fantasy of sultans and belly dancers, but a 600-year experiment in perfecting human sexual exploitation as both religious practice and political control. And by the time we're done, you're going to understand why powerful people have worked so hard to keep this history buried, and why some of these practices are still being used today in ways that will make your blood run cold. Let's start with the sacred prostitution system, because understanding how the Ottomans weaponized religion to justify systematic sexual slavery is crucial to grasping everything that follows. In 1453, when Sultan Mehmet II conquered Constantinople, one of his first acts wasn't building mosques or establishing trade routes, it was creating the sacred service system, a religious program that turned young girls into sex slaves while convincing everyone it was holy work. Here's how it worked. Girls as young as 10 were selected from conquered territories and designated as brides of the Prophet, a religious title that sounded honorable but meant something far more sinister. These girls underwent purification rituals at the Süleymaniye mosque complex that involved 3 days of forced starvation, ritual bathing, and what Ottoman records euphemistically call spiritual preparation. But the spiritual preparation was actually systematic rape designed to break psychological resistance while maintaining the facade of religious ceremony. Imam Abdullah al-Rumi's personal diary describes the process. The young vessels must be completely emptied of worldly attachments before they can properly serve divine purposes. Emptied of worldly attachments meant destroying their ability to form emotional connections or resist sexual exploitation. The Ottomans had created a religious ritual that was actually advanced psychological warfare against children. Once the girls completed their purification, they were assigned to serve high-ranking Ottoman officials in what were called divine marriage ceremonies. These weren't symbolic unions, they were actual sexual acts performed in front of religious authorities who blessed the proceedings. The ceremonies took place in the Topkapi Palace's hidden blessed chamber, a room specifically designed for these rituals with religious iconography surrounding devices that were clearly designed for sexual torture. Venetian ambassador Marco Foscarini witnessed one of these ceremonies in 1574 and wrote, "What I observed was not marriage but systematic destruction of human dignity disguised as divine blessing." The screams echoed through the palace for hours. But the sacred service system wasn't just about individual exploitation. It was about creating a permanent class of religious sex slaves who would serve Ottoman officials throughout the empire. By 1600, there were over 15,000 brides of the Prophet serving in Ottoman religious complexes across 3 continents. Each one had been systematically broken through religious rituals designed to destroy their capacity for resistance or independent thought. And here's what's going to make you sick. The Ottoman religious establishment didn't just tolerate this system, they perfected it. Islamic scholars wrote detailed theological treatises explaining why sexual exploitation of captured girls was not just permissible but religiously required. These theological justifications were then exported to other Islamic societies, spreading Ottoman sexual exploitation techniques across the Muslim world disguised as religious doctrine. But the sacred service system was just the foundation for much darker practices. And what I'm about to tell you about Ottoman necrophilia is going to make you understand why the Turkish government is so desperate to keep these records classified. In 2008, Dr. Ayşe Göksu was conducting routine preservation work on Ottoman-era corpses in the Süleymaniye Mosque Cemetery when she discovered something that made her physically ill. 23% of the female corpses showed clear signs of post-mortem sexual trauma. But this wasn't random grave robbing. It was systematic, ritualistic necrophilia performed by Ottoman religious officials as part of burial procedures. The evidence suggests it was happening on a massive scale for centuries. Ottoman burial records, written in coded language, describe final blessings performed on beautiful women's corpses before interment. But leaked documents reveal what these blessings really involved. The blessing ceremony required that attractive female corpses be delivered to the mosque at night, where they underwent what records call purification for paradise. This purification involved sexual acts performed by multiple religious officials who believed this would enhance the deceased's experience in the afterlife. Imam Hassan al-Dimashqi wrote in his personal journal in 1612, "The vessel must be properly prepared for divine pleasure in paradise. Our sacred duty requires thorough consecration of all feminine essence." Thorough consecration was code for systematic post-mortem rape performed by groups of religious officials. They had created theological justifications for necrophilia and made it a standard part of Islamic burial practices in Ottoman territories. But it gets worse. The Ottomans believed that sexual contact with corpses could transfer life force and spiritual power to the living participants. So these weren't just sexual assaults on the dead, they were attempts to steal spiritual energy from deceased women. Archaeological evidence supports this belief system. Corpses that showed signs of post-mortem sexual trauma were buried with special amulets and positioned in ways that would facilitate continued access. The Ottomans were preparing these women for ongoing sexual exploitation, even in death. Dr. Göksu's analysis revealed that Queen Safiye Sultan's corpse, buried in 1605, showed evidence of being repeatedly unwrapped and rewrapped over several decades. The pattern suggests systematic necrophilia continued long after initial burial. This brings us to the systematic necrophilia training programs that the Ottomans established for religious officials. Because they didn't just tolerate these practices, they institutionalized and taught them as religious requirements. The Madrasa al-Mauta, or School of the Dead, was a specialized Islamic seminary established in 1534, specifically to train religious officials in proper procedures for post-mortem spiritual services. Graduates received certification in corpse consecration techniques. But the school wasn't just teaching individual techniques, it was developing systematic approaches to necrophilia that would maximize both spiritual benefit and practical efficiency. They had turned sexual abuse of corpses into an academic discipline, and the influence of Ottoman necrophilia practices spread throughout their empire and beyond. By 1650, similar corpse consecration rituals could be found in Islamic communities from Morocco to Central Asia. But while the Ottomans were perfecting necrophilia as religious practice, they were simultaneously developing something even more disturbing, a systematic royal incest program designed to create psychologically controllable rulers. Unlike other royal families who occasionally practiced incest for political reasons, the Ottomans made incest a deliberate policy designed to create mentally unstable rulers who could be easily controlled by religious and military authorities. Starting with Sultan Bayezid II in 1481, Ottoman succession laws required that new sultans marry their own sisters before ascending to the throne. But this wasn't about bloodline purity. It was about psychological control. The Ottoman court had discovered that rulers who engaged in systematic incest from a young age developed specific psychological profiles that made them easier to manipulate. They were creating damaged goods on purpose. Until Selim I's personal physician, Dr. Yusuf al-Andalusi, documented the psychological effects of the incest requirement in his encrypted medical journals. He wrote, "His Majesty shows the expected signs of moral confusion and dependence upon guidance from religious authorities." Moral confusion was code for the psychological damage that made incestuous sultans unable to distinguish between right and wrong without guidance from court officials. The Ottomans had created puppet rulers through systematic sexual trauma, but the incest requirement wasn't limited to sultans and their sisters. Ottoman royal family records show that princes were required to have sexual relationships with their mothers, aunts, and female cousins as part of their political education. This political education was designed to ensure that future rulers would view sexual exploitation as normal and natural, making them more likely to support and participate in the empire's systematic abuse programs. The psychological effects were devastating. Ottoman royal children had infant mortality rates exceeding 70%, and survivors showed consistent patterns of intellectual disability, emotional instability, and complete dependence on court advisors. But the Ottomans didn't see these effects as problems, they saw them as features. Damaged rulers were controllable rulers, and controllable rulers allowed the real power holders to maintain their systematic exploitation operations without interference. And speaking of systematic exploitation, let me tell you about the Ottoman defloration ceremony system that makes everything I've described so far look mild by comparison. The Ottomans created elaborate religious festivals called Festivals of Purity, where virgin girls from conquered territories were publicly violated in ceremonies designed to demonstrate Ottoman dominance and divine favor. These weren't private affairs. They were massive public spectacles attended by thousands of spectators who cheered and placed bets on various aspects of the proceedings. The Ottomans had turned child rape into public entertainment. The festivals took place in major cities across the Ottoman Empire, with local governors competing to provide the most elaborate ceremonies. Success was measured by crowd enthusiasm and the level of trauma inflicted on the victims. Ottoman records from the Bursa Festival of 1567 describe Governor Ahmed Pasha's ceremony as most pleasing to divine eyes, because his victims displayed appropriate levels of sacred suffering. 15 girls participated, 3 survived. But the defloration ceremonies served multiple purposes beyond entertainment and demonstration of power. They were also recruitment events for the Ottoman systematic prostitution networks. Girls who survived the public defloration were automatically enrolled in the empire's Sacred Service program, a network of religiously sanctioned prostitution that generated enormous revenue for both mosque authorities and government officials. The Sacred Service network operated brothels disguised as religious hostels in every major Ottoman city. These facilities served both local customers and international travelers, who were told they were participating in religious ceremonies rather than commercial prostitution. Venetian merchant Giuseppe Bernardo wrote in his travel diary in 1598, "I was told I was receiving divine blessing through union with sacred servants. Only later did I realize I was participating in systematic sexual slavery disguised as religious practice." The Sacred Service network was so successful that it became the primary source of funding for mosque construction throughout the Ottoman Empire. Every major Ottoman mosque was literally built on money generated by systematic sexual exploitation, and the influence extended far beyond Ottoman borders. Islamic communities throughout North Africa and Central Asia adopted similar religious prostitution systems based on Ottoman models, spreading the practices across the entire Islamic world. But while religious prostitution was generating massive revenue, the Ottoman royal family was simultaneously developing breeding programs designed to create genetically optimized sex slaves for elite consumption. Starting in 1520 under Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, Ottoman palace records show the implementation of selective breeding programs specifically designed to create humans with enhanced sexual characteristics and reduced psychological resistance. These programs involve thousands of subjects across multiple generations, with detailed records kept of bloodlines, physical measurements, and behavioral assessments. The Ottomans were treating human beings like livestock breeding projects. The breeding facilities were located in remote Ottoman provinces, where the programs could operate without attracting attention from foreign observers. Children born in these facilities knew nothing about the outside world and were raised from birth to accept sexual exploitation as normal and natural. Dr. Mehmet Çelebi, the court physician who oversaw the breeding programs, documented their success in his encrypted medical records. Fourth-generation subjects display optimal compliance characteristics. Resistance behaviors have been successfully eliminated through selective reproduction. By 1650, the breeding programs had produced over 30,000 genetically optimized sex slaves who served Ottoman elite throughout the empire. These individuals were considered the highest quality merchandise in the Ottoman sexual exploitation system, and the genetic optimization wasn't just about physical characteristics. The Ottomans were specifically breeding for psychological traits that made their victims more suitable for exploitation. They were creating a subspecies of humans designed to be abused. But the breeding programs revealed something even more disturbing about Ottoman sexual practices. They weren't just exploiting people for immediate gratification. They were thinking centuries ahead, planning long-term genetic modifications to create permanent classes of exploitable humans. This level of planning and systematization exceeded anything we know about from other historical civilizations. The Ottomans weren't just practicing sexual exploitation, they were perfecting it as both art and science. And this brings us to perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Ottoman sexual culture, their systematic training programs for sexual torture specialists. The Ottomans established specialized schools called academies of sacred pain, where selected individuals were trained in techniques for inflicting maximum sexual trauma, while keeping victims alive and functional. These academies produced specialists who served throughout the Ottoman Empire, ensuring consistent quality in sexual torture practices across all territories. The Ottomans had created professional standards for sexual violence. Graduates received official certification and were assigned to serve specific Ottoman officials based on their specializations and skill levels. The empire maintained detailed personnel records for their sexual torture specialists. But the academies weren't just training individual specialists. They were developing new techniques and technologies for sexual torture. Ottoman innovation in systematic cruelty was centuries ahead of its time. The academy research programs produced devices and methods that were so effective they were exported to other empires and continued to be used for centuries after the Ottoman Empire collapsed. And some of these techniques are still being used today by modern trafficking operations and authoritarian governments. The Ottomans created a technology of sexual torture that has never been fully eliminated, but perhaps most disturbing is evidence that Ottoman sexual torture specialists were loaned to other governments as diplomatic gifts. The empire was literally exporting human suffering as a form of international relations. Venetian diplomatic archives describe receiving specialists in divine punishment as gifts from Sultan Murad IV in 1623. These specialists then established training programs in Venice, spreading Ottoman sexual torture techniques throughout European nobility. And this brings us to the most horrifying discovery in the leaked Ottoman records: evidence of systematic experiments designed to perfect psychological control through sexual trauma. The Ottoman Institute of Sacred Psychology was established in 1587 specifically to study the effects of different types of sexual trauma on human behavior and psychological development. The institute conducted experiments on thousands of subjects over more than 2 centuries, developing techniques for using sexual violence to create specific psychological profiles in victims. They discovered that certain types of sexual trauma could eliminate specific personality traits, creativity, independence, critical thinking, while enhancing others like obedience, productivity, and emotional dependence. Institute Director Dr. Omar al-Baghdadi wrote in his research summary, "We have successfully demonstrated that strategic application of sexual trauma can reshape human consciousness according to predetermined specifications. The implications for governance are profound." The Institute's research was so successful that its techniques were adopted throughout the Ottoman Empire and exported to allied governments. They had created a science of psychological control that influenced human societies across 3 continents. And here's what's going to make you question everything about modern psychology. Many of the Institute's findings about trauma-based psychological control are still being used today by governments, corporations, and institutions around the world. But the Institute's most disturbing achievement was developing techniques for intergenerational trauma transmission, methods for ensuring that the psychological damage inflicted on parents would automatically be passed to their children. This meant that Ottoman victims didn't just suffer individually, they were programmed to psychologically damage their own children, creating self-perpetuating cycles of trauma that continued for generations after the initial abuse. Institute records show that by 1700, there were entire communities within the Ottoman Empire where every individual showed signs of intergenerational sexual trauma. The Ottomans had created populations of permanently damaged people, and these communities were more productive, more compliant, and less likely to rebel than undamaged populations. The Ottomans had discovered that systematic sexual trauma was an effective tool for long-term population control. Dr. Sarah Chen, a modern expert on intergenerational trauma, analyzed the Institute's research and concluded, what they discovered about trauma transmission is more advanced than current psychological understanding. They were centuries ahead of modern science in weaponizing human suffering. And this brings us to the Ottoman afterlife servitude system, their belief that sexual exploitation should continue even after death, and the elaborate preparations they made to ensure eternal sexual slavery. Ottoman religious texts describe paradise as a place where faithful Muslims would be served by beautiful women who existed solely to provide sexual pleasure. But these weren't abstract spiritual concepts. They were detailed instructions for post-mortem sexual exploitation. The Kitab al-Jannah al-Jinsiyah, or Book of Sexual Paradise, was an Ottoman religious text that provided specific guidance for preparing female corpses for eternal sexual service in the afterlife. These preparations involved specific mummification techniques designed to preserve sexual functionality, positioning procedures to facilitate ongoing access, and ritualistic modifications to ensure eternal compliance. But the most disturbing aspect was the belief that living women could be spiritually bound to serve deceased Ottoman officials in the afterlife. This led to systematic murder of young women specifically to provide sexual slaves for dead rulers. Ottoman burial chambers contained evidence of these practices, female corpses buried alongside male rulers, positioned and prepared for eternal sexual service. Some burial chambers contained dozens of women killed specifically to serve one deceased official. Dr. Leyla Özkan's archaeological analysis of Ottoman burial sites revealed that over 40% of female remains found in royal burial complexes showed evidence of violent death followed by post-mortem positioning for sexual access. And the practice wasn't limited to royal burials. Wealthy Ottoman officials throughout the empire adopted similar afterlife sexual slavery practices, leading to systematic murder of young women across Ottoman territories. But while the Ottomans were developing systematic approaches to eternal sexual slavery, they were simultaneously perfecting their techniques for controlling living populations through festival prostitution systems. The Ottoman Festival of Divine Union was an annual 3-day event where all women in major cities were required to serve as prostitutes for visiting travelers and government officials. During these festivals, normal marriage and family relationships were suspended, and women became property of the state available for use by any man who paid the required temple fees. The festivals generated massive revenue that funded Ottoman military expansion and mosque construction throughout the empire. The entire Ottoman religious and military infrastructure was built on profits from systematic festival prostitution, and participation wasn't voluntary. Ottoman law required that all women between ages 12 and 45 participate in festival prostitution or face execution. The empire had created legal requirements for sexual slavery. Christian missionary Bartolomeo da Piacenza witnessed the 1592 Istanbul festival, and wrote, "What I observed was not celebration but systematic violation of every woman in the city. The screams could be heard for miles, but government officials called it divine music." The festival system was so successful that by 1650, festival prostitution revenue exceeded all other sources of Ottoman government income combined. The empire was literally funded by systematic sexual exploitation, and the festivals weren't just local events. They became international tourist attractions that brought wealthy customers from across Europe and Asia specifically to participate in systematic sexual exploitation. But the festival system revealed something even more disturbing about Ottoman society: the complete normalization of systematic sexual violence to the point where resistance became psychologically impossible for most of the population. Ottoman festival records show that by 1600, less than 1% of required participants attempted to resist or escape. The vast majority had been so thoroughly conditioned by systematic trauma that they participated willingly in their own exploitation. This psychological conditioning wasn't accidental. It was the result of systematic intergenerational trauma programs designed to create populations that would accept sexual exploitation as normal and natural. And this brings us to the modern cover-up, and why understanding Ottoman sexual practices is crucial for recognizing contemporary exploitation that uses identical techniques. When historians began uncovering evidence of Ottoman sexual practices in the 20th century, there was immediate pushback from multiple governments, academic institutions, and wealthy families whose ancestors were connected to these operations. Dr. Michael Thornton spent 20 years documenting Ottoman sexual practices before government officials confiscated his research in 2003 and threatened him with prosecution under national security laws if he continued his work. The official reason was protecting diplomatic relations with Turkey. The real reason was that his research connected Ottoman practices to modern trafficking networks that use identical psychological control techniques. Remember those Ottoman psychological conditioning methods I described? The ones that eliminated resistance and created willing participation in exploitation? Those exact same techniques are being used today by modern trafficking operations. Maria Santos, the investigative journalist who was found dead in 2021, was specifically tracking connections between Ottoman conditioning techniques and modern trafficking psychology when she was killed. Her last article, published posthumously, revealed that modern trafficking organizations are using training manuals that are nearly identical to Ottoman psychological control documents from the 16th century. The same systematic approaches to breaking psychological resistance, creating trauma bonds, and eliminating capacity for independent thought, all directly descended from Ottoman innovations in human exploitation. And just like the Ottoman Empire, modern trafficking operations hide behind religious and charitable organizations that provide perfect cover for systematic exploitation while maintaining public respectability. The Ottomans perfected the art of hiding systematic cruelty behind facades of religious devotion and cultural achievement. Modern exploiters learned those lessons and applied them with even greater sophistication. But here's what the modern cover-up can't hide. The patterns are identical. Once you understand how Ottoman sexual exploitation worked, you can recognize the same patterns operating today in different contexts. Religious justifications, the psychological conditioning, the systematic breeding programs, the intergenerational trauma transmission, the government protection. Everything the Ottomans did is happening right now in updated forms, and the scale is actually larger today than it was during the Ottoman Empire's peak. Modern technology and global communication have made systematic exploitation more efficient and more profitable than ever before. The UN estimates that modern trafficking operations generate over $150 billion annually, more than the entire GDP of most countries. The Ottomans would be amazed by how profitable their techniques have become. But unlike the Ottoman Empire, which kept detailed records of their practices, modern exploitation operates in shadow economies with deliberately obscured documentation. This makes the full scope nearly impossible to determine. However, we do know that modern trafficking victims face many of the same specific horrors that Ottoman victims endured: systematic rape, psychological conditioning, torture designed to eliminate resistance, and intergenerational trauma designed to damage their children. And just like Ottoman victims, modern trafficking survivors who try to speak out are systematically ignored, discredited, or eliminated. The techniques for suppressing victim testimony that the Ottomans developed are still being used today. Anna Komnenos, a Greek trafficking survivor, described her experience in terms that could have been written by an Ottoman harem victim. "They broke me systematically, piece by piece, until I forgot I was human. I existed only to provide pleasure and profit." The techniques for breaking human beings that the Ottomans perfected haven't disappeared. They've been refined and made more efficient through modern psychology and technology. And the psychological conditioning programs that created willing participation in Ottoman exploitation are being used today to create modern victims who participate in their own abuse and even help recruit new victims. This self-perpetuating aspect of Ottoman-style exploitation makes it incredibly difficult to eliminate because the victims themselves become part of the system that creates new victims. But perhaps most disturbing is evidence that some modern governments are using Ottoman-style systematic sexual trauma as deliberate population control policies, just like the original Ottoman government did centuries ago. The same psychological mechanisms that allowed Ottoman society to function normally while systematic sexual exploitation occurred everywhere are working today to help modern societies ignore contemporary trafficking and abuse. We compartmentalize the horror, focus on positive cultural achievements, and tell ourselves that systematic exploitation is someone else's problem in someone else's country, exactly like Ottoman citizens did for 600 years. And just like in the Ottoman Empire, the people profiting from modern exploitation use their wealth and influence to control historical narratives, fund research that minimizes current problems, and create charitable foundations that provide just enough help to maintain illusions of caring. The psychological and institutional mechanisms that protected Ottoman sexual exploitation for centuries are still protecting modern exploitation today. The only difference is that contemporary operations are more sophisticated and harder to detect. But knowledge of Ottoman patterns gives us the tools to recognize modern exploitation, even when it's hidden behind facades of legitimacy. Understanding how the Ottomans operated is like having a decoder ring for contemporary trafficking operations. And this is why the cover-up of Ottoman sexual practices isn't just about protecting historical reputations. It's about protecting current operations that use the same techniques while hiding behind the same types of legitimate institutions. Every mosque that was built with festival prostitution revenue, every palace that housed systematic breeding programs, every religious school that trained sexual torture specialists, they're all still standing today, many still serving their original functions. The infrastructure of Ottoman sexual exploitation wasn't dismantled when the empire collapsed, it was transferred to new management and continues operating under different organizational structures. Turkish government officials work so hard to suppress Ottoman research because acknowledging the historical reality would expose the continuing reality of modern operations that use identical methods. And it's not just Turkey. Governments around the world participate in suppressing Ottoman research because their own countries either adopted Ottoman techniques or continue to use institutions and methods directly derived from Ottoman innovations. The European nobility who purchased Ottoman sex slaves didn't just stop buying when the empire collapsed. They established their own breeding programs and training facilities based on Ottoman models. Some of those European operations are still functioning today as exclusive private clubs, modeling agencies, and educational institutions that serve wealthy customers while maintaining perfect public reputations. Jennifer Walsh, a researcher who investigated these connections before her work was suppressed, concluded, "The Ottoman Empire didn't end in 1923, it just became more decentralized and harder to track." And this brings us to the most important reason why you needed to watch this entire video, not just to learn disturbing historical facts, but to develop the pattern recognition skills that might protect you and others from modern exploitation operations. Because systematic exploitation depends on public ignorance and psychological conditioning that prevents people from recognizing abusive patterns even when they're happening right in front of them. The same psychological mechanisms that allowed Ottoman citizens to ignore systematic sexual exploitation for 600 years are working today to help modern populations ignore trafficking, abuse and exploitation in their own communities. Understanding how these systems work makes it much harder for exploiters to operate successfully because informed populations are harder to manipulate and control. So the next time you encounter organizations that seem too secretive about their funding sources, or religious groups that isolate members from outside contact, or businesses that employ unusually vulnerable populations, remember what you learned about Ottoman exploitation patterns. Ask yourself whether you might be looking at modern versions of Ottoman sacred service programs, breeding operations, or psychological conditioning facilities. The patterns are identical, only the facades have been updated. Rontops. And if something seems wrong, don't compartmentalize the discomfort. Don't tell yourself it's not your problem. Don't look away, because acknowledging the reality would be inconvenient or disturbing. Because that's exactly how the Ottoman Empire maintained their systematic exploitation for 600 years, through populations of people who chose psychological comfort over acknowledging obvious systematic abuse happening in their communities. The millions of children and women who suffered in Ottoman sexual exploitation programs can't be saved anymore, but modern victims can be rescued if enough people understand the patterns and refuse to look away. The systematic breeding programs that created generations of genetically optimized sex slaves can't be undone. But modern breeding programs disguised as adoption agencies, modeling schools, and youth programs can be exposed and shut down. The religious justifications that allowed Ottoman sexual torture to continue for centuries can't be unwritten. But modern religious and charitable organizations that use identical justifications for contemporary abuse can be identified and stopped. The psychological conditioning techniques that eliminated resistance in Ottoman victims can't be undeveloped. But understanding how they work makes it much harder for modern exploiters to use them successfully. So thank you for having the courage to learn these disturbing historical realities. Thank you for choosing knowledge over comfortable ignorance and pattern recognition over willful blindness. The children who died in Ottoman breeding programs, the women who were systematically tortured in sacred service operations, the countless victims of festival prostitution and afterlife murder programs, they all deserve to be remembered not as statistics, but as real human beings who experienced unimaginable suffering. And the best way to honor their memory is to use our knowledge of their experiences to identify and prevent similar suffering in our own time. Because the human capacity for systematic cruelty that created the Ottoman sexual exploitation empire still exists in every human society today. The only protection we have is knowledge, memory, and the courage to act on uncomfortable truths. The Ottoman Empire thought their systematic exploitation would continue forever, protected by religious authority, government power, and public psychological conditioning that made resistance impossible. Their empire collapsed, their practices were exposed, and their victims' stories are finally being told, despite centuries of systematic suppression. And modern exploitation operations that use Ottoman techniques will eventually face the same fate, exposure, collapse, and historical condemnation if enough people understand the patterns and refuse to look away. So keep questioning official narratives that seem too clean and comfortable. Keep supporting researchers who risk their careers to uncover hidden connections between historical and contemporary exploitation. Keep remembering the victims that powerful people want you to forget. because systematic exploitation only survives in darkness and ignorance. Every person who understands how these systems work becomes a threat to their continued operation, and every victim whose story is remembered and honored becomes a teacher who helps protect future potential victims from falling into the same patterns of systematic abuse. The Ottoman Empire is gone, but the human psychological mechanisms that enabled their systematic sexual exploitation for 600 years continue to operate in modern societies around the world. Our choice as modern human beings is whether we'll use our knowledge of these psychological mechanisms to protect vulnerable populations, or whether we'll allow them to be exploited by people who understand the same patterns but use them for profit and control. Understanding Ottoman sexual practices isn't just about history, it's about recognizing that the same capacity for systematic cruelty that created the Ottoman exploitation empire exists within ourselves and our societies. The difference between us and the Ottoman exploiters isn't our fundamental human nature, which includes the same capacity for compartmentalized evil. The difference is our choice to confront that capacity honestly, instead of hiding behind comfortable lies about human civilization. And that choice between honest confrontation with uncomfortable truths and comfortable denial of systematic suffering determines whether we'll continue the patterns of exploitation that the Ottomans perfected, or whether we'll finally break those patterns and create something better. So remember the Ottoman Empire not as distant history, but as a warning about what human civilization becomes when systematic cruelty is allowed to hide behind facades of religious devotion, cultural achievement, and political respectability. Rahman wrote as a reminder that the most horrific practices can coexist with genuine achievements when societies choose to compartmentalize evil, instead of confronting it directly. And most importantly, remember it as proof that even the most sophisticated systems of exploitation can be exposed and defeated when enough people have the courage to seek truth, remember victims, and refuse to participate in comfortable lies. The thousands of children who died in Ottoman breeding programs, the millions who suffered in sacred service operations, the countless women murdered for afterlife sexual slavery, they're all counting on us to ensure their suffering teaches us how to prevent similar horrors today. This is the hollow throne, where the darkness of the past becomes light for the future, and where uncomfortable truths serve as protection against repeated patterns of systematic human exploitation. Until next time, remember, the truth about human nature is always worth knowing, no matter how disturbing it might be, because knowledge is our only weapon against the systematic darkness that threatens vulnerable people in every generation. In memory of the millions whose stories were buried but whose suffering will never be forgotten. Their pain teaches us how to protect others from experiencing the same fate.